Jason Beaumont had 13 children with his minor daughter, the most endogamous man ever revealed inside Louisiana. A story as disturbing as it is real, involving generations of isolation and family practices that challenge human nature itself. The year was 1976, when St. Landry County authorities, Louisiana, received an anonymous complaint about an isolated property in the swamps. approximately 40 kilometers from the small town of Opelousas, a place that locals avoided decades, surrounded by stories whispered only in low tone in local bars. The Beaumont farm had existed in that marshy region since the late 19th century, when Jeremiah Beaumont, a lonely and suspicious man, settled there with his young wife after the Civil War. What no one knew at the time was that that property would become the epicenter of one of the most disturbing stories of family endogamy already documented in the United States. Jason Beaumont, born in 1932, was the third generation of the family living in that property. Son of Theodore Beaumont and his first cousin, Eleanor, Jason grew up practically without contact with the outside world. The family remained isolated, cultivating only enough to survive and avoiding any interaction with the local community. In 1953, Jason married Martha Thibodeau, a young woman from an equally secluded family who lived a few miles away. Martha gave birth to 4 children, being Sarah the youngest, born in 1959. After Martha's death during the birth of a 5th son, who did not survive, in 1962. Jason started raising his children alone, increasing the isolation of the family. Agent Henry Reynolds, who answered the complaint on that damp day of July 1976, describes what he found in his official report. When I arrived at the Beaumont property, I was received by a man of about 45 years, gray hair and beard to do. His appearance was sloppy, and he was extremely suspicious. I identified myself as a local police officer and informed that he was there to check a complaint about the conditions of children on the property. The man, who identified himself as Jason Beaumont, hesitated, but allowed my entry into the residence. What Reynolds found within that deteriorated wooden house for the swamp's time and moisture would cause nightmares in the following years. Inside the house, 17 people lived: Jason, his daughter Sarah, then 17, and 15 children, all presenting evident signs of development problems and peculiar physical characteristics. The children had a number of obvious physical anomalies, the report continues. Many had facial deformities, motor difficulties, and appear to be cognitive development below expected for their ages. The older ones seemed to be about 13 years old, and the youngest was just a baby. When asked who the children were, Jason simply answered, "They are my children." When asked about the mother of the children, he pointed to Sarah, his own daughter. Check it out if it is already registered with this channel. The history of the Beaumont is just one of the many that would remain hidden from society if it were not for our investigative work bringing to light these disturbing realities that make us question the limits of the human condition. Subscribe now, not to lose any details of this case that will change your perspective on social isolation and its devastating effects. The Beaumont case did not start with Jason. To understand the depth of this family tragedy, we need to return to the late 19th century, when Jeremiah Beaumont established the foundations of what would become one of the most endogamic strains ever recorded in recent American history. Jeremiah Beaumont arrived in Louisiana in 1868, fleeing a dark past in Virginia. Historical documents suggest that he had already been expelled from his previous community due to inappropriate family practices, as the euphemisms of the time described. He settled in St. Landry's marshy region with a young woman who presented as his wife, but who later investigated were his sister, Catherine. The Beaumont family has established itself in a particularly isolated region of the swamps, explains local historian Dr. Raymond Doucette, who extended family genealogy. At that time, it was not uncommon for families to live in relative isolation in the rural areas of Louisiana. But the Beaumont took this isolation to an extreme. They rarely appeared in the city, and when they did, they avoided any social interaction beyond the absolutely necessary. Jeremiah and Catherine had 6 children. Of these, only 3 reached adulthood: Thomas, Rebecca, and William. Parish records show that in 1890, Thomas married his sister Rebecca at a ceremony held by Jeremiah himself, which it cited distorted biblical passages to justify the union. From this marriage were born 4 children, including Theodore, Jason's father. Theodore in turn married his cousin Eleanor, daughter of William. The couple had 3 children, Jason, Marie, and Robert. Marie died as a child due to congenital heart complications, while Robert had serious cognitive and physical limitations, common characteristics in advanced cases of endogamy. What we see in the Beaumont family is a consistent pattern of consanguineous marriages over at least 4 generations, explains Dr. Elaine Moreau, a geneticist at the University of Louisiana. When close relatives have children, the likelihood of harmful recessive genes drastically increases. In a normal population, these genes rarely cause problems because they need to be inherited from both parents to express themselves. However, in families with a high degree of consanguinity, this probability increases exponentially with each generation. Dr. Moreau continues, "What makes the Beaumont case particularly tragic is that we are not just talking about an isolated case of endogamy, but of a systematic practice over several generations." Jason's coefficient of consanguinity was already extremely high due to family history, and his children with Sarah represents one of the most extreme cases of documented endogamy. When Jason took control of property after his parents' death in a 1952 fire, he already carried the weight of generations of isolation and endogamic practices. His marriage to Martha Thibodeau, although not with a well-known direct relative, occurred within an extremely limited social circle. Subsequent investigations would suggest that the Thibodeau family possibly had ties far from the Beaumonts, making the coefficient of consanguinity even more complex. The 4 sons of Jason and Martha's marriage, Michael, John, Emma, and Sarah, already showed signs of genetic problems. Michael had a deformity in the spine that gave him a hunchy appearance. John suffered from a form of dwarfism and limited cognitive development. Emma had severe vision problems, being practically blind at 10 years. Sarah, born in 1959, was the one that appeared to the least obvious physical problems, although later medical reports indicated that she suffered a slight cognitive retardation and had an extreme docility and inability to contest, characteristics that would become fatally relevant in the following years. In 1962, when Martha died during delivery, the Beaumont family became even more isolated. Jason, in mourning and with 4 young children to raise, almost completely withdrawn from any contact with the outside world. It was in this environment of extreme isolation, permeated by generations of endogamic practices and social disconnection, that the horror of the situation would reach its peak. The beginning of the improper relationship between Jason and his daughter Sarah remains hazy in the official records, but the testimonials collected during the investigation suggest that he began around 1973, when Sarah was about 14 years old. Michael and John, Sarah's older brothers, had left the property a few years earlier, Michael to work on oil platforms in the Gulf of Mexico, and John to live with an isolated religious community that accepted their limitations. Emma, almost completely blind, depended entirely on her father and sister to survive, according to her testimony provided years later to social workers. She knew something was wrong, but her dependence and isolation imposed by Jason made any intervention impossible. The first child of the relationship between Jason and Sarah was born in 1974, when she was only 15 years old. For the next 3 years, she would give birth to 3 more children, all presenting severe development problems. When the authorities intervened in 1976, Sarah was again pregnant. What we found in this property was the result of generations of isolation and endogamic practices taken to the extreme, explains forensic psychologist Dr. Catherine Larompe, who worked in the case. Jason Beaumont grew in an environment where normal borders between family relations had been completely distorted. For him, behavior was not deviant, it was simply the continuation of a family standard. One of the most disturbing discoveries of the investigation was the diaries held by Jason, who revealed a profoundly distorted worldview based on a mixture of superstitions, extremely peculiar religious interpretations, and pseudo-scientific notions on purification of family blood. At a 1973 entrance, he wrote, "Beaumont's blood is special. We have to keep it pure. The world outside is contaminated. Sarah understands that now. You who are watching, leave us with awe. Social isolation can lead to the destruction of an entire family." This phrase reflects the tragedy that we are witnessing in this story. It makes us reflect on the importance of healthy social ties for human development. The investigation revealed that Jason had absolute control over the property. A high fence surrounded the perimeter, and the few neighbors who tried to approach over the years were received with hostility and threats. The nearest house was more than 4 kilometers away, and the family rarely went to the city. It was as if that property existed in a parallel reality, reports Harold Jenkins, one of the few traders who occasionally interacted with Jason when he went to the city to buy supplies. Everyone knew there was something strange to the Beaumonts, but no one wanted to get involved. There were stories about them for decades, but people just preferred to maintain distance. When asked why he never denounced his suspicions to the authorities, Jenkins replied, "At that time, and in that region, you didn't get into the affairs of others, especially if these others had the reputation of the Beaumont." As children born of the relationship between Jason and Sarah came to the world, the genetic effects of extreme consanguinity became increasingly evident. Of the 13 children born to the time of police intervention, 15 were alive, including Emma and 2 twin children born in the last birth, but all had serious health problems. 4 had polydactyly, extra fingers in the hands or feet. 6 had significant facial deformities. 9 had some degree of cognitive commitment. 5 suffered from congenital heart problems. 3 were completely deaf. 2 presented total blindness. Sarah herself, after so many births in precarious conditions and with her own health, committed by endogamy genetics, was in a debilitated state. Dr. Robert Johnson, a doctor who examined Sarah after his property removal, reported she had signs of multiple pregnancies in rapid succession, chronic malnutrition, and complete lack of prenatal care. Her mental state was worrying, a combination of previous cognitive limitations and apparent psychological dissociation, probably as a defense mechanism. The complaint that led the authorities to the Beaumont property came from a hunter who, having been lost in the swamps during a storm, approached the house in search of shelter. What glimpse through the windows was enough, for as soon as he returned to the city, he went to the local sheriff's office. "I have never seen anything like it," said George Landry, the hunter in question. "There were children everywhere. Many of them looked not natural. It was like being in another world, a place where something had been terribly wrong." When Agent Reynolds hit the property on July 1976, he began the dismantling of a horror cycle that had endured for generations. But the real challenge would be to deal with the human consequences of this family tragedy. The intervention of the authorities on the Beaumont property in July 1976 triggered an unprecedented social assistance operation in St. Landry County. Of this 15 children found in the house, 13 born of the relationship between Jason and Sarah, as well as Emma, Sarah's sister, and a newborn baby whose parents could not be determined for sure, were immediately removed from the property and taken for medical evaluation. Dr. Thomas Williams, a pediatrician who coordinated initial care, described the situation as the most extreme case of medical neglect and genetic damage to consanguinity he had already found in his 30 years of career. Many of the children had never received any kind of medical care, reported Dr. Williams. Some had treatable conditions that had been left without care for years, significantly aggravating their problems. In addition to the obvious genetic issues, there was malnutrition, parasitic infestations, and signs of extended exposure to unhealthy conditions. The impact of the case was so significant that an entire wing of the Lafayette Regional Hospital was temporarily designated to serve Beaumont children. New Orleans and even universities from other states were consulted to deal with some of the most complex cases. The eldest son of the relationship between Jason and Sarah, then 12 years old, had a rare combination of genetic conditions, including a severe form of craniocerosticisms, premature closure of cranial sutures that had never been treated, resulting in pressure on the brain and permanent cognitive impairment. 3 of the youngest children suffered from a rare cardiac condition that required emergency surgeries. Jason Beaumont was immediately arrested and accused and multiple crimes. Sarah was initially hospitalized for medical treatment and psychological evaluation. The question of his legal responsibility has become a central point of debate during the following judicial proceedings. Sarah Beaumont represented an extremely complex case from a legal and ethical point of view, explains lawyer Charles Dupper, who accompanied the case as assistant of the district prosecutor. On the one hand, she was clearly a victim. On the other, she had, in the technical sense, was an accomplice in the negligence of children. Psychological evaluations and family history of endogamies strongly suggested a small ability to discern and resistance to paternal authority. Jason Beaumont's trial, which began in March 1977, became one of the most notorious in Louisiana's judicial history. The defense tried to argue insanity based on family history and extreme isolation, but the jury did not accept this line of argument. In May 1977, Jason was sentenced to multiple penalties that, added, resulted in life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. During the trial, even more disturbing details about life on the Beaumont property surfaced. Jason was found to have an elaborate belief system based on religious distortions and superstitions. Dozens of notebooks found on the property. He believed that his family had been chosen to maintain a pure lineage, isolated from the contamination of the outside world. Jason Beaumont's writings reveal a completely distorted worldview, analyzes Dr. Paul Robichaud, a forensic psychiatrist who examined the documents. He had created a family mythology in which isolation and endogamic practices were not only acceptable but necessary for the spiritual survival of the lineage. The fate of children Beaumont has become a primordial concern for the authorities due to their complex medical needs and the psychological trauma suffered. Most were referred to specialized institutions. The efforts to find adopted families faced significant challenges due to the medical conditions of children and the stigma associated with the case. Emma, Sarah's sister, was sent to an institution for visually impaired in Baton Rouge, where she finally received adequate treatment for her condition. Years later, she would give enlightening interviews on life on Beaumont property, providing valuable insights into the distorted family dynamics that had developed over generations. "We grew up believing that the outside world was dangerous," reported Emma in an interview granted in 1992. "Our father said we could only trust the family, that everyone else wanted to separate us and destroy our way of life. When you grow up listening to it every day, in complete isolation, it believes." Sarah Beaumont spent 2 years in a psychiatric institution before being considered able to face a reduced judgment. In addition to her condition as a victim and psychological assessments that confirmed her limited ability to resist paternal authority, she received a suspended sentence and was sent to a supervised rehabilitation program. In 1985, 8 years after the trial, a team of geneticists at the University of Tulane published a detailed study on the genetic standards of the Beaumont family, which became a reference in the scientific literature on the effects of extreme consanguinity. The Beaumont case represents one of the most extreme examples of multi-generational endogamy already documented in modern medical literature, wrote Dr. James Monroe, the main author of the study. The coefficient of consanguinity of Jason and Sarah's children significantly exceeded any other previously reported case, resulting in an almost catastrophic expression of deleterious recessive characteristics. The study identified more than 30 distinct genetic conditions present in children, many of them extremely rare in the general population. The researchers estimated that the likelihood that so many conditions coexist in a family without a history of consanguinity would be statistically close to zero. Almost 50 years have passed since the authorities intervened on the Beaumont property, but the shock waves of this case continue to reverberate not only in the lives of those directly affected, but also in the way society understands the dangers of extreme isolation and endogamy. Jason Beaumont died in prison in 1989 at the age of 57, without ever showing repentance or understanding of the severity of his actions. Until her last days, she kept the distorted belief that she was protecting her family lineage. Sarah Beaumont, after years of intensive care and rehabilitation, was able to build a relatively stable life in a small CI Texas, where he lived under new identity until his death in 2011 at the age of 52. According to her long-term therapist, Dr. Richard Hamilton, she never completely overcome trauma, but managed to achieve a level of functionality that allowed her some quality of life. Sarah's case exemplifies both resilience and limitations of psychological recovery after extreme trauma, explained Dr. Hamilton in an academic article published with Sarah's posthumous permission. She was able to develop healthy relationships and even work as a volunteer in victim support programs. But the emotional and cognitive scars of isolation and abuse during her training years remained evident until the end. Of the 15 children found on the property in 1976, only 9 survived to adulthood. Complex medical conditions, combined with the psychological damage of extreme isolation, resulted in challenging predictions for the majority. Thomas, one of the youngest children, who was only 2 years old when he was rescued, became an advocate for the rights of children in vulnerable situations. Despite their own physical limitations, including severe scoliosis and congenital heart problems, he has obtained training in social work and dedicated his life to preventing stories like his own repeated. What happened to my family was not just the result of the actions of a disturbed man, said Thomas in a rare interview granted in 2018. It was the culmination of generations of isolation, inadequate education and cultural distortions that allowed destructive patterns to be normalized. Endogamy was only the most evident symptom of a much deeper problem. Beaumont property, abandoned after police intervention, was completely consumed by a fire in 1980. Some local residents claim that the fire was deliberately caused to clean the site of their disturbing associations. Today, the area has been reabsorbed by the swamps, and only the elders in the region remembered the exact location. The impact of the Beaumont case extended far beyond Louisiana's borders. The genetic study conducted by the University of Tulane became a reference material in medical and genetic courses throughout the country. The psychological and sociological aspects of the case are often analyzed in training programs for social workers and child protection professionals. In 1982, partially inspired by the Beaumont case, Louisiana authorities implemented specific programs to identify and monitor isolated communities, focusing on abuse prevention and ensuring access to basic health and education services. The most important legacy of the Beaumont case was awareness of the dangers of extreme isolation, says Dr. Melissa Richards, a social work professor at the University of Louisiana. Before this case, there was a tendency to respect the privacy of reclined families, even when there were worrying signs. Today we understand that isolation can be a significant risk factor for various types of abuse from the scientific point of view. The Beaumont case remains one of the most extreme examples of the effects of prolonged endogamy in humans. Genetic studies with Beaumont children contributed significantly to the understanding of the inheritance mechanisms of various rare genetic disorders. What we observed in the Beaumont family was essentially an unintentional genetic experiment that would never be ethically allowed under normal circumstances, explains the geneticist Dr. Alan Peterson. The information obtained through the study of these cases, although stemmed from tragic circumstances, has assisted in the development of genetic tests and counseling for families with a history of hereditary diseases. In 2016, the history of the Beaumont was included in the medical ethics curriculum of several American universities, highlighting the complex ethical, legal, and medical questions involved in cases of extreme isolation and endogamic practices. If you watched so far, it is because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more real cases, stories that reveal the darkest aspects of the human condition. Leave your like in this video and share it with someone that you know would be interested in this impactful account about the devastating consequences of social isolation and endogamic practices. The history of the Beaumont serves us as a dark reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and distortions that can occur when communities separate completely from the broader social fabric. It is also a testimony of human resilience, exemplified by that survivors who, despite almost unimaginable adversities, managed to find some meaning and purpose in their lives.